I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss what many are calling a turning point in the war and in Western foreign policy, as the Trump administration declares definitively the US will no longer be a primary guarantor of Europe's security and seeks a deal with Moscow over the heads of Kyiv and its allies. We hear the latest reaction from Brussels and Ukraine and consider the options for those Western nations that remain committed to Ukrainian independence.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 13th of February, 2 years and 349 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, our Brussels correspondent, Joe Barnes, dialing in from the NATO summit, and staff writer at The Spectator, Ukrainian journalist Svitlana Morenets. Normally, we start with the military updates, but today, given the gravity of recent developments, we begin with politics. In the first episode of 2025, we said, a sense of urgency has been lacking in the West so far, but perhaps this might be the year when, confronted with certain realities, calculations change and reality bites. Well, yesterday, reality bit, not once, but twice. The first came with the stark words by Pete Hegseth, Donald Trump's US Defense Secretary. He was addressing Ukraine's military allies at the NATO summit, laying out how the new administration would approach negotiations. Dom's going to cover the remarks in more detail shortly, but the most important line was as follows. I'm here today to directly and unambiguously express that stark strategic realities prevent the United States from being the primary guarantor of security in Europe. Those few words lay bare the biggest shift in US foreign policy since 1945. He then went on to say that Ukraine returning its pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective, that the US does not believe NATO membership is advisable for the country, and rejected US boots on the ground as part of a peace settlement. But these stark confirmations, not revelations, but confirmations of what many have suspected for a long time, were just the beginning. Within hours came another. Contrary to expectations in Europe that it and Ukraine would be part of negotiations, Trump had gone over their heads and was directly dealing with Putin. I just had a lengthy and highly productive phone call with President Putin of Russia, posted the president on social media. We discussed Ukraine, the Middle East, energy, artificial intelligence, the power of the dollar, and various other subjects. We both reflected on the great history of our nations and the fact that we fought so successfully together in World War II, remembering that Russia lost tens of millions of people and we, likewise, lost so many. We each talked about the strengths of our respective nations and the great benefit that we will someday have in working together. But first, as we both agreed, we wanted to stop the millions of deaths taking place in the war with Russia and Ukraine. President Putin even used my very strong campaign motto of common sense. We both believe very strongly in it. We agreed to work together very closely, including visiting each other's nations. We've also agreed to have our respective teams start negotiations immediately, and we will begin by calling President Zelensky of Ukraine to inform him of the conversation, something which I will be doing right now. I've asked Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Director of the CIA John Ratcliffe, National Security Advisor Michael Waltz, and Ambassador and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff to lead the negotiations, which I feel strongly will be successful. Millions of people have died in a war that would not have happened if I were president, but it did happen, so it must end. No more lives should be lost. I want to thank President Putin for his time and effort with respect to this call, and for the release yesterday of Mark Fogel, a wonderful man that I personally greeted last night at the White House. I believe this effort will lead to a successful conclusion, hopefully soon. Now, you'll have noted the absence of the more hawkish US Special Envoy to Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg, from the names Trump mentioned. Not long afterwards came a much shorter statement by Trump. He said he'd just spoken to President Zelensky of Ukraine, that the conversation went very well, and that he, like Putin, wants to make peace. We discussed a variety of topics having to do with the war, but mostly the meeting that is being set up on Friday in Munich, where Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio will lead the delegation. I am hopeful that the results of the meeting will be positive. It is time to stop this ridiculous war, where there have been massive and totally unnecessary death and destruction. God bless the people of Russia and Ukraine. Now, there are reports that the hemorrhaging of principles implicit in the above was the price to get Russia to the negotiating table. But what a price to pay for talks which many believe are unlikely to succeed anyway, which we'll get to. Lest we forget, Moscow has already scored a diplomatic victory just by the fact of that telephone conversation. Think back 3 years. Putin's decision to launch a full-scale invasion turned him into a pariah. Later, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for him for war crimes. Biden condemned his Russian counterpart as a murderous dictator and a pure thug. Now, Putin has got what he wants, the chance to negotiate directly with the US on Ukraine and the opportunity to put himself on the top table of international politics, despite the war. Now, in a few minutes, Joe and Svitlana will be covering in more detail the huge wave of reaction in Europe and Ukraine. But as one commentator put it, it signals a US retreat from its self-image as the vanguard for the spread of Western values. Another, Trump speaks far more positively, indeed glowingly, about autocratic Putin and Russia than he does about his own democratic allies. Another, this is not peace through strength, it's continued war through weakness. A strong US leader would issue an ultimatum to Russia, demanding the invaders withdraw from Ukraine, or the US will boost the defenders massively. Within minutes, Russia's foreign ministry was gloating that NATO had used up and written off Ukraine. Bluntly, as Trump's former National Security Advisor John Bolton remarked on TV last night, Putin couldn't be happier. I tell you, they're drinking vodka straight out of the bottle in the Kremlin tonight. It was a great day for Moscow. Very quickly, senior EU officials scrambled to put out their own statement, which implicitly rebukes the US approach, which was their and Zelensky's biggest fear, that the US would talk over them. The EU's foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas said, as she published it, Ukraine's independence and territorial integrity are unconditional. Our priority must be now to strengthening Ukraine and providing robust security guarantees. In any negotiation, Europe must have a central role. The statement by Germany, France, Poland, Italy, Spain, the UK, the European External Action Service and the European Commission reads, "We are ready now to enhance our support for Ukraine. We commit to its independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity in the face of Russia's war of aggression. We share the goal to keep supporting Ukraine until a just, comprehensive and lasting peace is reached. A peace that guarantees the interest of Ukraine and our own. We are looking forward to discussing the way ahead together with our American allies. Our shared objective should be to put Ukraine in a position of strength. Ukraine and Europe must be part of any negotiations. Ukraine should be provided with strong security guarantees. A just and lasting peace in Ukraine is a necessary condition for a strong transatlantic security. We recall that the security of the European continent is our common responsibility. We are therefore working together to strengthen our collective defensive capabilities." But while reality has now bitten hard for Europe, reality is going to bite the US too at some point soon. To quote one of our episodes last year, the Kremlin may posture as conciliatory, claiming openness to meaningful talks. But what if Putin's proposals are unacceptable to Ukraine and its allies? That remains true. Trump cannot impose a peace on Europe and Ukraine if the deal Washington and Moscow present is deemed untenable. Many European countries have woken up to see that their own defence is directly threatened if Putin is seen to succeed. That if it can fight Russia now with Ukraine, or fight Russia alone after Putin takes control of large numbers of Ukraine's resources. Given this, I'd still argue the threats Trump can make to Ukraine and its allies to end the war will always be less than he can make to Russia. And if a lasting, meaningful peace is truly the goal, that is an immovable reality, especially if Trump wants to be seen to be having achieved a diplomatic victory and profiting economically in the process. Another is that Russia is as strong now as it will ever be without a pause to the fighting, even in the scenarios of an end to sanctions, which would be illogical given Trump wants to be an energy exporter to Europe. It cannot replace its military losses whilst waging a war at this level. As one expert put it, the overall balance of power remains far more favourable to Ukraine, even with only European support. The only scenario in which Ukraine loses is if it determines that the costs of continued resistance outweigh the costs of concession. That is a political decision, not a material inevitability. The challenge for Europe will be what to do next to demonstrate that no matter how long the war lasts, European support will sustain Ukraine's resilience. It could deploy troops. It could accelerate Ukrainian membership to the EU. It could make clear it will never recognise the occupied territories. But there is little unity as yet in Europe on any of these. There needs to be, and fast. All this sets the stage for the Munich Security Conference this weekend. Either history has a dark sense of humour, or Cleo, its muse, is serving us a warning. But at least Chamberlain in the 1930s, along with many others, used post-Munich to rearm and build up alliances. In 1939, he was ready for war, whereas it would seem Trump cares little if Putin attacks the Baltics after he's done with Ukraine. This is about great power politics now. The fight is far from over, but it is clear. Finally, and definitively, this is Europe's war. The continent's first task will be to reassure Ukraine and make sure morale there does not fracture. Then, laying out what more it can do to assist, and make that the new reality. But Dom, over to you next. You watched Pete Hegseth's speech yesterday. Lots more to unpack from that. Where do you want to start?
Well, thank you, Francis. Let's just do a little bit of news, if we may. So NATO defence ministers are meeting in Brussels today, making preparations for the NATO summit in The Hague in June. A lot for them to think about, especially after US Secretary of Defence Pete Hegseth's speech yesterday at the Ukraine Defence Contact Group in Brussels, the Ramstein Group, as it's often known. Now, yesterday's big news wasn't, somewhat surprisingly, met by a very large Russian barrage last night. Just for the numbers, so we need to keep on top of these things. 140 drones fired by Russia last night, all but 3 shot down or brought down, continuing the pattern of recent months. However, attacks across the rest of Ukraine killed 1, injured many more. No move to the front lines, but also continuing another recent pattern. Another long-range drone strike by Ukraine. This one targeted the Novolipetsk steel plant. That's Russia's largest steel mill, about 400 k's from Ukrainian lines. That produces about 20% of Russia's steel output. And that news came from a pro-Kremlin media outlet. So the war does carry on. But let's have a look at what Pete Hegseth actually said yesterday. And I'm going to ask you a question after we've gone through these points. I'm going to ask you, what has changed? But let's zone in on 3 points if we can. So I'm going to quote from a couple of things that he said. As Francis alluded to a moment ago, he said, "We will only end this devastating war and establish a durable peace by coupling Allied strength with a realistic assessment of the battlefield. We want, like you, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine, but we must start by recognising that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. Chasing this illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering. A durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again. This must not be Minsk 3.0. Now, just on that last point, Minsk, you'll remember after the 2014 invasion by Russia, all the little green men and what have you running around Crimea and Luhansk Donetsk, completely out with the Geneva Conventions, unmarked uniforms. The Minsk protocols were negotiated under the auspices of the OSCE, the Organisation for the Security and Cooperation in Europe, with France and Germany kind of mediating the talks. 2 rounds of agreements, Minsk 1 in 2014, that then collapsed, so Minsk 2 in 2015. They sought to establish ceasefires and chart the path to a durable peace. They both collapsed because they were ultimately too inherently weak. They didn't reflect reality, and Putin wasn't interested in them. So Minsk 1 and 2 utterly collapsed, but the European nations and the world actually sort of, patted itself on the back and said, well, we did what we could. So interesting that Pete Hegseth says this is not going to be Minsk 3.0. But that talk about going back to the 2014 borders, he could have softened the language a bit. He could have added a nice diplomatic fudge, such as in the short term. We hear that a lot and say, okay, we'll define short term. Is that tomorrow or in 5 years' time, whatever? So he could have softened the language. But is the prospect of Ukraine not reclaiming all its land immediately a new idea, I ask you? Okay, number two, second thing that Pete Hegseth said. The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. Now, again, he could have softened the language with, and we're talking about NATO membership, he could have said da-da-da-da-da, but the path to NATO membership continues. Again, though, I ask you, is that a new idea? No, it's not. And think about it. If there was right now any prospect of Ukraine membership of NATO, that would undoubtedly be vetoed by Hungary, Slovakia. They would have objected, maybe others as well. But not a new idea. And the third one, for me, when Pete Hegseth said, to be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be US troops deployed in Ukraine. We were discussing that exact point at least a month ago. Trump staffers said as much. I think it was leaked to the Wall Street Journal. Might have been WAPO, but I think it was Wall Street Journal. And it's not a million miles from Biden's position. And it leaves room for manoeuvre. There could be US intelligence support outside the country or training and what have you. But just taken on face value, no US troops deployed in Ukraine. Is that a new idea? So, let's not pretend that a lot of these ideas weren't lurking just behind the escalation curtains in the Biden White House. There's a lot of heat and light here, but I don't think, in and of themselves, these are particularly new ideas. They're just said out loud. Now, a couple of other things struck me yesterday. Pete Hegseth said, we're also here today to directly and unambiguously express that stark strategic realities prevent the United States of America from being primarily focused on the security of Europe. The United States faces consequential threats to our homeland. We must and we are focusing on security of our own borders. We also face a peer competitor in the communist Chinese with the capability and intent to threaten our homeland and core national interests in the Indo-Pacific. The US is prioritising deterring war with China in the Pacific. Now, that is a clear call for Europe to step up. Of particular note, I think, was the reference to core national interests in the Indo-Pacific. That is not the Reagan version of peace through strength that was based on values, i.e. the bedrock of NATO and pretty much any defensive alliance. The Trump administration's talk of peace through strength, this idea is based, as Pete Hegseth explicitly stated yesterday, on core US interests. Taiwan, take note. Now, the US is saying here, aggression can be rewarded. Our priorities are elsewhere. We are focusing on ourselves. Russia and China, among others, will be delighted to hear that. It also makes clear that the Trump administration doesn't have an America first policy. This is closer to an America only policy. Now, that is a perfectly respectable position for a sovereign nation to take, but it does surrender global leadership. Hegseth said, quote, our transatlantic alliance has endured for decades and we fully expect that it will be sustained for generations to come. But this won't just happen. It will require our European allies to step into the arena and take ownership of conventional security on the continent. So note that phrase there, conventional security. The US nuclear umbrella, of course, is still there, but that might be all. So big questions now about how far America will retreat from global leadership. Any claim to be the leader of the free world, I think, has just been relinquished. And we hear there in the news from Francis that Donald Trump discussed yesterday with Putin, quote, the power of the dollar. Well, it's certainly going to dent the dollar's status as the global reserve currency if you retreat from leading the world, I would venture. There are questions, too, about how reliable an ally America is. Questions about how any settlement that rewards aggression and does not ensure a credible deterrent force is not going to avoid criticism of being Minsk 3. So big questions. But big questions for Europe too. You may remember retired British General Sir Richard Barron speaking at the Lucerne Dialogue in Switzerland in October 2023. He was addressing European business and political leaders. And he said at the time, the only way Ukraine wins is if we mobilise our industry and our will behind that. Do not tell me it's unaffordable because you, pointing to all the European leaders, so not the US, just the Europeans, you represent an economy of 15 trillion euros a year. And I can feed the Ukrainian army on about 75 billion euros for 2 or 3 years, and I can make them win. This is not about affordability. This is about choice. So Europe, it's in Europe's gift to do this. It is all about choice for Europe and for others. But for Britain, dialing in here for a moment, if I may, what now for Britain's much vaunted tilt to the Indo-Pacific? As in, we're a global power, we've got a global navy. We're going to take an active interest in the Indo-Pacific. Now, we could, as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned, we could offer a carrier strike group, which right now would be essentially the entire Royal Navy and all the F-35Bs in Navy and RAF service. But the US has just made it clear that they want European nations to focus on Europe, and that means the Atlantic. So as Britain's MOD limps towards the fag end of the ongoing Strategic Defence Review, co-authored by Richard Barron, I might add, I'm wondering, are they going to tear the whole thing up, scrap this tilt to the Indo-Pacific and focus on Euro-Atlantic security now that everything has changed? So a lot of questions, but I start with those 3 points. Look at Pete Hegseth's words and say, what is new? What did we not know or very strongly suspect before?
Well, thank you very much, Dom, for your reflections there. And of course, there's so much more that we can be talking about, and I'm sure we will shortly. But Joe Barnes, I want to bring you in here, our Brussels correspondent. Now, you're in Brussels, where Mr. Hegseth gave those remarks Dom was just summarising. I wonder if you can just capture the mood of the officials that you've spoken to there following those remarks and the revelations of the call between President Trump and President Putin.
Yeah, hi, folks. It started off pretty gloomy, and that's before we even learned that Donald Trump had been on the phone to Vladimir Putin. As you were alluding to earlier, there was 2 steps to it. You had what Pete Hegseth announced about the US focus dwindling on European security and saying that Europe is no longer our primary focus. Really concerning for the Europeans because it's a wake-up call. They've known has been coming, but it's actually puts it in it's sort of the stark reality of that actually kicking in. And then you have the Ukraine stuff. And before he sort of revealed the outline, the blueprint of this blueprint for peace that Washington's been cooking up seemingly over the heads of everyone, people in Brussels, Europeans, were warning, look, don't say too much about it. Putin's watching. Putin is sitting there. Let's not put him on the front foot by telling him exactly where we're going to concede straight away. And by taking NATO membership off the table, even though I would say it wasn't actually ever going to be part of this peace settlement anyway, but you don't have to tell Moscow that. You've taken away one area of leverage on your side by saying that US troops aren't going to be involved in a peacekeeping mission. Again, that's another area of concern that Vladimir Putin can forget about and concentrate on what he wants to achieve from this. And I think that has been sort of met in the terms of someone told me that they had to keep a poker face when Hegseth was speaking in the room because essentially, like, they had to remain professional, but they knew that all hell was breaking loose and this guy was basically throwing away the family silver. But then there's been other interesting developments. I'll point you towards some new Kaja Kallas words from an interview today. She has basically accused Donald Trump of appeasement by opening negotiations over the head with Europeans and, most crucially, Ukraine. She said, any deal behind our backs will not work. Any agreement will need also Ukraine and Europe being part of it. And this is clear that appeasement also always fails. Any quick fix is a dirty deal. We've seen before, it won't stop the killings. She added, it's not a good negotiation tactic if you give away everything before the negotiations have started. That can't work. Appeasement will always fail. So essentially, look, her words are as clear and unambiguous as you can get. That's what we've always expected from the straight-talking former Estonian prime minister. But if you then, we've got words floating around like, oh, Donald Trump has thrown Europe under the bus here, thrown Ukraine under the bus. There's fears about what Donald Trump's going to do next to undermine Europe. You've already got to remember, in a slightly different context, Donald Trump is waging an economic war against Europe with the introduction of trade tariffs and It's basically trying to undermine trading relations, is something that Europeans would say. Is he going to throw the bill for Ukraine's reconstruction straight at Europe and say, look, that's your problems, not mine? Who's going to pay for and equip and properly make sure that this peacekeeping force that he's insisting on as part of the deal is actually going to be able to be efficient and actually worth sort of the paper it's written on? The NATO membership thing that Hegseth announced, whether it was part of the peace deal or not, that's really going to concern some Europeans, and I'd say the Brits as well on this one, because they've been pushing really hard to further Ukraine on the path to NATO, even if the Americans, the Germans, the Slovakians, the Hungarians had been more cautious and sort of put that into the distance. But what I will say is a little bit of inside info. As defence ministers are meeting, officials in NATO's headquarters have almost been wargaming on how to keep Ukraine in the alliance's orbit. So NATO officials are insisting that the membership pledge for Ukraine, which dates back to 2008, we've got the well-lit path, the irreversible path to membership that was declared in Washington. I think off the top of my head, there's so many summits. But this is what a senior alliance official had to say. It is a decision for allies. Nothing there has necessarily changed. NATO allies, including the US, remain committed to Ukraine. It is still a commitment. It is a matter of time. What was said by Hegseth, that the US want membership at this time, that is not contradictory to membership when the conditions are met. So basically, the Europeans inside NATO are trying to keep that dream alive. There's just so much language floating around I can talk you through. Boris Pistorius, the German defence minister, as he arrived for the second day of talks in Brussels today, he sort of voiced concerns over the concessions made by the US to Putin. He spoke about how Russia will always remain a threat to Europe beyond the end of the war. That's one thing you've got to remember is the US is slightly turning its back, whether that be sort of something that we should have seen coming. We've heard about them. It was inevitable that it was going to happen one day. It's happening now when there is a resurgent Russia again on our border. You've got John Healey arrive saying, we want to see a durable peace and no return to conflict and aggression. But let's not forget, Russia remains a threat well beyond Ukraine. Again, sort of words of concern. And there are definite questions, and there will be soul searching going on in capitals, in Brussels, about whether Europe can actually defend itself. We've got lots of capable militaries. We've got some of the best tech in the world, including stuff we bought in from the Americans. We've got 100,000 American troops here, but is the alliance as sturdy and steadfast as it once was? People are going to say it is, but actually, what does Article 5 mean? That mutual defence clause, the attack on one is an attack on all mantra. Does that mean anything now? There's going to be so much soul-searching triggered by this. But yeah, it's an interesting mood, I'd say, despondent, lots of disappointment, especially around Ukraine's most ardent backers, but sort of planning is underway because it needs to happen.
Well, thanks very much, Joe, for telling us the mood music in Brussels. Some people are even saying this is the end of the West, that Donald Trump doesn't recognise this idea of the West and Western values, and therefore different entities are going to be coming together now, or will be obliged to, because the old world that we all knew, we all grew up in, and has been the case since 1945, has just been shredded. But we've had plenty of warning, as you say. But Svitlana, of course, the most important reaction of all is that in Ukraine. I see in the last 10 minutes or so, President Zelensky has said that he will not agree to any deal that is agreed between Russia and the United States over the heads of the Ukrainians. But I wonder, first of all, if you could just comment on the mood amongst Ukrainians in the past 24 hours or so following those revelations.
Hi, Francis. Of course, you should have seen the storm of anger and despair that swept through Ukrainian social media last night. Just imagine you have been fighting to defend your country, your land for 3 bloody years of full-scale war. And then Trump and his team come in and hand over all the concessions to Putin before formal negotiations even begin. And don't get me wrong here, Ukrainians were not naive. We knew that the chances of being accepted into NATO while 20% of our country remains occupied by Russia were very slim. We knew that retaking all those territories in a military way after 2023 became even less likely. But the problem here is that Trump didn't have to give up these negotiation points before the talks even started. And this is what Ukrainians are so angry about, have demanded something in return from Russia. If Putin wants Ukraine out of NATO so badly, what will he give in return? The same goes for Trump saying there will be no American boots on the ground monitoring the front line. Fine, we get it. But why wouldn't he exchange that concession for one from Russia? For now, it seems that Putin is allowed to dictate whatever terms he wants. And for me, as a Ukrainian, and for a lot of Ukrainians, the worst thing was Trump saying that Article 5 from NATO won't apply to European troops stationed along the front line after the so-called peace deal is made. And it just reminds us Minsk agreements, and imagine that British soldiers who are likely to be among those peacekeeping troops, they will be not protected by NATO's Article 5. And what security guarantee can Ukraine receive as strong as Article 5? There is not one existing right now. And the worst news for Ukrainians is that our main ally is leading us into another Minsk-style agreement, and the war hasn't ended yet. And Ukrainians are already talking about how they should prepare for the next one. And I may sound desperate or pessimistic, but I have already seen 2 so-called peace deals with Russia on Putin's terms, and I'm only 26. And now it looks like I will have to witness a third one, and there is nothing I can do to change that. And this is how many Ukrainians feel today, that we didn't do enough. And it's what I'm hearing from my friends, from soldiers. And even though we paid the highest price with the lives of tens of thousands of our soldiers and civilians, Trump can't even answer whether he sees Ukraine as an equal party in this peace process. And in his speeches, he didn't say a single bad thing about Russia. He didn't say that Russia is the aggressor. He didn't acknowledge that Russia came to kill Ukrainians. He didn't demand a single concession from Putin. And for now, it seems that all that matters to Trump is getting American money back in exchange for Ukrainian rare minerals and making a quick deal to stop the killing. Ukrainians don't have nothing against stopping the killing, but the price Ukraine is being asked to pay is too high. And I have seen the calls from Ukrainians on Facebook for Zelensky not to agree to that deal, that America will receive some money back in exchange for Ukrainian rare minerals, because for now it seems that we are not getting any security guarantees from US. Then why should we sign a deal and give them something in exchange? So the things don't look good right now. And I would say that nobody is feeling envy to Zelensky and our government right now, because for now it seems whatever decision they make, it won't be a good option for Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Svitlana, for that overview of the understandable reaction in Ukraine. A bit of a blunt question, but I wonder if you could answer or give a sense of an answer to the question of how would you measure Ukrainian resilience and defiance to this? Do you think that there will be a deflation of morale as a consequence of this at the front line? Or do you think that Ukraine is strong enough and believes it has the support of Europe enough to continue fighting regardless of what Washington says?
I would say that it made our morale stronger, because Ukraine is not gonna agree to the terms that make all the sacrifices our soldiers made just go in vain. And the best thing that Zelensky can do right now is try to unite European countries around Ukraine and to pressure US to include Ukraine. And I can't believe that I'm saying that we have to pressure someone to include Ukraine and Europe into the negotiations with Russia, because the fate of Europe depends on how this war ends. I just will say that for Ukrainians, the best thing we can do now is try not to fall into despair, and the fight is not over yet, and much can still change.
Well, thank you very much, Svitlana, for your reflections on that. Just one final question, which is that we saw a development yesterday, which is that President Zelensky has approved a decision by the National Security and Defence Council to impose sanctions on the former President Poroshenko. Not the best timing, given what you were saying about unifying Ukrainian society. I just wonder if you can explain the thinking behind that. Is this all part of the tensions playing out in the political realm at the moment, and Zelensky trying to keep a handle on it?
To be honest, I don't understand the decision and why it had to come in this moment when Ukraine has so much at stake. Zelensky and Poroshenko, they were rivals since 2018 when they were competing for the position of the president of Ukraine. The logic that Zelensky says right now to sanction Poroshenko is because he had business in Russia during the war with Russia and other things. But Zelensky had business in Russia too before he became the president, but Ukraine was already fighting a war with Russia. So many people in Ukraine see it as Zelensky is getting ready for the next elections, and he is trying or to remove Poroshenko from the competing field or to do the opposite, to rise Poroshenko's ratings and to make people support him. So in the end, Zelensky is competing against Poroshenko and not against Zelensky, who is likely to win the elections if he decides to take part in them. It's hard to understand what was the logic of doing it right now. And all the analysts, Ukrainian political reviewers, all what I read today, everybody is against it. It's not the time for that. Even if Poroshenko is guilty of some things, it should have come or earlier or after Ukraine has dealt with a peace deal and there is no more fighting. I would say it was a mistake, but we have what we have.
Svitlana, thank you very, very much. We'll come back to you shortly for your final thoughts. But I'm going to bring Dom back in now. Dom, as Svitlana was saying there, Article 5 is, if not endangered, it's, of course, been put on the table by Pete Hegseth in the sense that he says that he thinks if any peace deal is agreed with Europe and Ukraine and Russia, and of course with Washington as an overseer, that Article 5 would not be invoked if there were troops on the ground that were fired upon by Russians, and that is an enormous concern for the Ukrainians. Do you think, bluntly, and I'm being blunt here, do you think that the whole notion of Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all, is now imperiled?
No, I don't think so. Article 5 has only ever been invoked once, and that was by the United States of America after 9/11, the terrorist attacks on September the 11th, 2001. Now, you could argue that some of the allies didn't turn up with much more than a bad scowl and a couple of sort of cooks and bottle washers, but it was not in any danger that people were going to turn to. Now, is it under danger? Is it under threat? Well, it's always had this kind of useful ambiguity about, well, what does it mean? For example, in 2018, when there was a Russian nerve agent attack on the streets of Britain that killed Dawn Sturgis in Salisbury, in this country, people said, that's it, that's war, it's a nerve agent attack, streets of Britain, Article 5. Yeah, the government took a different view. So an attack on troops from a NATO country doesn't immediately and obviously mean that it's an Article 5 moment. A bit like nuclear diplomacy, it's preferable to have these discussions out of the public eye, out of the public gaze. Leaving that useful ambiguity, as I say, is helpful in military and diplomatic circles. But I don't think there's anything here that means that if there was a recognised, certainly if it was a UN-endorsed plan, or if it was endorsed by the NATO Council, the sort of main steering committee, the political side of NATO, I think it would be clear what is and what isn't an Article 5 moment. And I don't think, troops don't necessarily think in those terms all the time, and politicians don't either. It's like, well, is it covered by the umbrella? Is it not? That's going to constrain their action if it does. So no, I mean, it's easy to say, well, this would be the first British, French, Spanish, whatever soldier who was hurt by a Russian drone. It's Article 5. It's not that easy and immediate. In a way, I'm quite glad that Pete Hegseth didn't say anything more about Article 5. And I do hope that the conversation is now allowed to sort of drift into, well, it could mean this, it could mean that, because the person you want to keep guessing about what does it actually mean, of course, is number one, Red Square, Moscow.
Well, thanks very much for that, Dom. One other rather blunt question to put to you, but is, what would you do? I mean, Europe now faces some really significant decisions in terms of supporting Ukraine. There are all sorts of options on the table, more, less. I wonder, where would you start in trying to unpack this?
Well, I think the first thing I'd do is recognise that this doesn't mean that Russia is suddenly winning. I mean, they've not been able to move further than a few kilometres across the front for about a year and a half, something like that. I mean, Ukraine took in Kursk region in a week, what's taken Russia the best part of a year to take across the front. They're having some success at the moment, but we're talking hundreds of meters a day, if that. So this army is broken. We've seen this army that is no longer using armoured vehicles because there's not many left. They think the IISS, where I was yesterday, International Institute for Strategic Studies, think that Russia's got about a year left of armoured vehicles. We've already seen civilian vehicles being used in Ukraine. We've seen motorbikes and sort of golf buggies painted green, and Russia says, well, this is it gives tactical mobility. It's just a sensible use of other modes of transport. Yeah, okay. We've seen donkeys being used. I mean, this is not the army that it pretends to be, and it's not going anywhere. There hasn't been a sudden breakthrough. Ukraine is holding the line generally. Air defence is working generally. So it has to be supplied with what it needs at the moment. And if the US step back from military materiel supplies, then that's a big ask for Europe. But at the moment, it's about 50-50, the whole of Europe combined against America. Granted, the whole of Europe. But Ukraine is holding the line. They're not making any breakthroughs themselves, a little in Kursk, of course. But Russia's not going anywhere. This army is broken. So what would I do? I would acknowledge that, for starters. I would take risk as a military person in this country, if I was in any kind of leadership position, take risk. So the Russian land army, one of the biggest threats to Europe, so not the Air Force, not the missile force, not the Navy, although that's a bit ropey. The submarine service, Russian submarine service, is very good. But the land army is broken. The Russian green machine is broken. What have we got to counter that? Well, largely we've got our own tanks. Tanks are there to kill T-72s, essentially. We could take risk on that. When's the Russian army going to be back at the current pace of the money that Putin's shoveling towards it? 5 years, 6, 7, 8, take your pick. But there's a gap there. We could take risk. We could not keep investing now, in Britain, for example, in upgrading Challenger 2 to Challenger 3, same hull, largely a new turret, new gun. Great. I'm told if that came into service this afternoon, it would be phenomenal. If it comes into service in 10 years' time when it's planned, it will be very good. I'm suggesting that if you take a bit of a capability gap now and put that money into Challenger 4, or maybe even come up with a more inventive name, you might, by the time the Russian land army has built any kind of strength, you'd have a phenomenal capability. So I think you could take some risk now. What else would I do specifically? I'd stick troops in Kyiv. I'd put Western troops in Kyiv just to be there, just to make the point. Kyiv is not going to fall. So Russia's maximalist aims, Putin's maximalist aims have taken the whole country. Can't really do that if the capital city is still free. Not there to say they're going to start a fight, but unless fight wants to come to them, but make it very clear, and it's a political statement as much as anything else, that the Kyiv is not going to fall. What else would I do? I would announce a brigade level, so a brigade of about 5,000 troops-ish, a brigade level JEF exercise, JEF being the Joint Expeditionary Force, 10 northern European nations, everywhere from sort of Iceland through Britain, Scandinavia, Baltic nations, that kind of thing.
The more hawkish ones in Europe.
Well, as Ben Wallace said, the beer drinkers that turn up on day one, kind of thing. So the JEF nations, Joint Expeditionary Force, announce a brigade-level exercise in western Ukraine and then go and do it. And don't sort of go off from there and do anything underhand, if you like, by trying to arm the Ukrainians, God forbid. But have a big exercise. Just say, look, it's not up to you, Putin. It's not up to you, Trump, or anyone to say where we can and can't go. We're going to do this exercise. We're going to go in, do it for 2 or 3 weeks, and then come out with tea and medals. So I'll do that. I would massively ramp up the FPV drone production, first-person view drone. Where did I hear the comment recently that the reason Ukraine's having to rely on first-person view drones is because they don't have the personnel. They haven't got the numbers of soldiers to put up with these waves of Russian and North Korean troops coming at them. So they're having to rely on first-person view drones to kill them. That seems quite a good idea, actually. Rather than putting your own people in harm's way, have $5,000 drones, if that, doing the job for you. So massively ramp up the FPV drone production. I would fund a proper defensive line across the front. Difficult to do that right at the front in contact now, but 5-10 Ks behind that. Actually put some decent trench lines, communication lines, put a decent border there. And finally, if I'm still, am I still wearing a military uniform now, or am I a politician?
Take your pick. You can be Ulysses S. Grant, in or out of uniform.
Brilliant. I'll be a bit of Ord Wingate, actually, if I may. I would adopt Estonia's plan, the Estonian plan that came out 18 months ago, that said if the NATO nations, European NATO nations, not the US, just the European NATO nations, committed 0.25% of GDP for Ukraine's defence for 4 years, then it would amass, I think it was 150 billion euro. I can't remember the exact number, but it is huge. It comes back to that point Richard Barron's was making earlier on, that European nations, the size of the economy is 15 times that of Russia. This is a choice. This is not the maths. We can do it if we wanted to. Estonia came out with a very good plan. They crunched the numbers. They worked out what would be needed then. It's probably still very live, actually, for the fight that is there today. 0.25% committed for 4 years. The important thing about the commitment is that it's not just like in-year money that you can go and spend now, but to know that you've got that funding line for 4 years. You can build the factories, you can build the tank factories and the artillery and what have you. You can actually know that this stuff's coming down the line. So I think the Estonia plan needs to be dusted off again. That's what I'd do.
Well, thank you very much, Dom, for your reflections there. Let's go to our final thoughts then. Svitlana, you've waited very patiently. Where do you want to start?
Well, I guess I would like to point out that for over a year now, Ukraine has not been trying to liberate its occupied lands because it simply couldn't. It has been fighting a defensive war to preserve Ukraine as an independent state. For Ukraine not to lose this war, it has to come out of these negotiations as an independent country, able to join the alliances it wants and take the decisions that its people want. So I just hope that our European allies will unite and stand on Ukraine's side in this difficult time.
Thank you very much, Svitlana. Dom Nicholls, you've got the final thoughts for today.
Thanks, Francis. I would just urge people, this is just a call for folks to take the news that's coming at us pretty fast at the moment. Just take it all in context. There's more news to come today from the NATO Defence Ministerial in Brussels, and this weekend the Munich Security Conference that's going on. But just take it through the lens of just keep asking yourselves, what has changed? How does this shift the dial? Now, Russia obviously sniffs an opportunity here. Of course they do. They're going to go hard on the legitimacy of Zelensky. They're going to say he needs to have elections, he's a busted flush, all the rest of it. Expect agitations, political agitations, not only, but obviously from the Kremlin, but also in the more sort of Moscow-leaning sections of the world, maybe a little bit of Hungary or Slovakia, maybe the AfD ahead of German elections in 10 days' time, possibly national rally in France. But that's Russia sniffing an opportunity and energising the grey zone network, if that's not too wonkish a phrase. But basically, if this war ends on anything like Putin's terms, anything that he can spin as good news, he will claim it as and make a lot of noise about it being a victory. So he has to lose, and he has to be seen to lose. So what has changed in reality after Hegseth's comments yesterday and Trump? Trump is saying out loud what many analysts thought was the position of the Biden administration for many months, if not years. We need to keep asking ourselves if the message has changed or just the messenger. And if the US has opened the kimono here, Europe best not look away.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war continues, we're relying on your support more than ever. You can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter, now X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.